I trust everybody has survived the excitement and gives us a little bit a sense, if I may say so, when we hear what is happening in far, not so far, and people have alarms and we just stand outside and come back, but other people who hear these alarms are not as fortunate to come back 15 minutes later and listen to a wonderful talk by Shireen Sayali. So, well, that's what it is. And I think we can now try to focus again. So it's my great honor and pleasure tonight to introduce then the third lecture of Professor Shireen Sayali. On this third evening, in introduction, Professor Sayali proper is, I think, no longer really needed. My colleagues already spoke to her impressive academic itinerary and to her scholarship. So all I need to do, and what I wish to do, is to highlight what we consider to be yet another distinct feature, and I should actually say pillar, of Shireen's research and professional engagement, one which connects her very deeply to Natalie Zemon Davis. This feature will be also, I assume, one of the aspects of tonight's talks, namely political engagement, intellectual commitment, and action in the public sphere. Edward Atiyah, tonight's protagonist, directs us to an aspect of the work and imprint which both Natalie Zemon Davis and Shireen Sayali consider to be important and relevant. Both scholars made it their passionate intent to decenter historical narratives, to give voice to marginalized individuals and groups, to challenge top-down elite-focused interpretations of history. This takes place in their research and in their writing, and it takes place in the institutions of learning and in the public realm. Speaking truth to power was a motif that led and leads both to stand up for convictions born of a sense of public responsibility. In the face of continuing attacks on academic freedom and freedom of expression, of military action and of violence as political means. For Natalie is remembered not only for her scholarship, as we all know, and the distinguished offices she held, she saw herself as a person with public commitment, which she understood as intricately tied up with her scholarship. This was a dimension of her work which she held high and which we also cherished in her work. The conservatism, conformism, and elitism that reigns in some disciplines and departments, certainly not ours, seem to go against both their temperaments. For Shireen Sayali, we see this in her editorship of the distinguished Journal of Palestine Studies and her regular commentaries from the editor. We see this when she engages with ongoing debates and issues, in her role as co-founder and co-editor of the important online journal Jadaliyya, her writings on scholasticide in Palestine and Gaza, her lead initiative in passing a resolution against the support of scholasticide in Gaza, which was adopted by vote by the distinguished American Historical Association, and so on and so on. In her work, Trickster Travels, Natalie Zemon Davis proclaimed routes, I hope I pronounce it properly, routes not routes, when referring to Maalouf's Léon l'Africain, whom he saw as a figure from the Mediterranean past who combined its multiple cultures. During the last two evenings, Professor Sayali guided us along paths taken and not taken, dead ends and routes well tested, developing personal narratives which transformed while we followed her in great attention from the subjective and individual into the social and political. Historical accompaniment as method. We are very curious to accompany you for yet another night and the next episode on Edward Atiyah. Dear Shireen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nadia, and thank you for really kindly uplifting that labor that so many of us do that often gets itself put to the margins. And I'm really grateful that you mentioned the American Historical Association, which for 2 years in a row, the majority of historians, as part of this, one of the oldest scholastic associations in the United States, a large majority of us for 2 years in a row passed this resolution by over 82% of the voters. And each time the executive committee actually vetoed the resolution. So there's a big battle and tension between regular, everyday rank and file people like us and the often our leadership or our lack of leadership and their cowardice. So I'm really grateful that you mentioned that work, and I'm so grateful to all of you for your attention and for being here and for inviting me. It's been such an honor. Over the last 3 days, we have traveled through medical records and financial accounts to reflect on freedom and unfreedom, friendship and family, disease and captivity, space and geography. From the late 19th century to 1920, our point of origin has been Durman and Khartoum. We have moved southeast to Addis Ababa, north to Haifa and Beirut, and spent some time in Damascus. A smallpox outbreak in Durman in 1903 offered an archival sliver of a 16-year-old's world. With Katusha, we learned about grief and joy, the will to survive against all odds, and the blurry line between hunting and healing that constituted colonial medicine. In another register, through an accountant's budgets, his attempts to regulate fluctuating currencies, fiscal calendars, and rates of exchange, we found glimpses into unexpected and somehow in our present foreclosed geographies. With Shukair, we learned about the imperative and the capacity to navigate multiple affiliations, British colonial service on the one hand, and a pan-Syrian project on the other. We have traveled through times of intense capitalist transformation. We have also been thinking with the dynamic and shifting structure of slavery, the relentless struggle for sovereignty, and the competing colonial promises that culminated in the devastation of partition. And I like to think that we've traveled through various portals that the historical actors I've spent time with have offered us, and the worlds that they've revealed about contingency and possibility. We've explored the overlapping, mutually constituting categories of the colonized and the colonizer, the Arab and white, the Arab and Black. As we have walked with our tour guides through their labor, we have focused in particular on the historian's craft. In accompanying these otherwise forgotten and marginal characters, we have thought together about the ethical imperatives to trace presence and absence, to map records and exit them, and to embrace our complicities. As I have shared with you, Katusha and Shukair found me as I searched for my family's history. And before I turn to the last actor we accompany on our journey, Edward Atiyah, I thought I would share with you a bit about what my great-grandparents have taught me about historical method. Here is a photograph of my great-grandparents, Naim Kutran, who lived from 1877 to 1961, and Anisi Saikali, who lived from 1896 to 1978. This photograph is from 1949, 1 year after the twin birth of the Israeli state and the inception of the Nakba, or catastrophe, of 1948. When 750,000 Palestinians became stateless and 150,000 became a minority on their own land in the new state of Israel. Naim and Anisi stand here broken on the grounds of their burnt orchards, orchards that my great-grandfather emphasized time and again in multiple petitions were, quote, my private property. They appear here as native refugees, denied political rights and peoplehood. They are dispossessed, living in the paralysis of catastrophic rupture. This ruptured temporality would come to define Palestinian life. Were my account to begin with this moment and work backwards from there, I might study British and Zionist movements, commercial enterprises, and power. But 1948 was only one moment of my great-grandparents' lives. And to learn from my ancestors, I really needed to ask more than how they became refugees. I needed to explore the other subjectivities they inhabited. And here I have to thank Naim, my great-grandfather, more than anybody, who is the person who led me to all of the actors that I've shared with you this week. This photograph was taken in 1915. Here you see an olive-skinned young man with a dapper mustache sitting authoritatively on a stool in Sudan. He wears a white suit and a black tie. His back is straight and his legs are crossed, his hands folded on his lap. Two black Sudanese men stand at attention a discreet distance away. One wears a turban, the other a fez. A pith helmet crowns the young man's disposition. It is a racialized symbol of his vulnerability to quote unquote tropical climates and diseases. Behind the three men is the civilian hospital where they all worked. So you can think of the story of Kantusha as actually traveling back into spaces such as this civilian hospital. The seated man, confident in his civilizational and racial superiority, is Naim. Here, my great-grandfather is a young man linked to the civilian hospital in the port of Suakin on the Red Sea. He is a junior partner in the British colonization of Sudan. He had received his medical degree from the University of Maryland in Baltimore in 1903, and he arrived to Sudan together with many Syrian Christians. Most of these doctors had trained in Beirut at the Syrian Protestant College, and some of them at Saint Joseph University. And until 1924, which is a very important date, when there is a very important uprising in Sudan, the Syrian Christians outnumbered both their British and Egyptian counterparts in the Sudan medical department. As I had mentioned to you, I believe yesterday in our discussion, the colonial governor of Egypt, Lord Cromer, who ruled Egypt and Sudan from 1883 till 1907, viewed Syrian Christians as superior to their Muslim brethren. The Syrian Christian, as he put it, really is civilized. And from a moral, social, or intellectual point of view, stands on a distinctly high level. End of quote. That's not me talking, that's Lord Cromer. So doctors like Naim, British officials assumed, were passive, apolitical, and white. In the minds of their British overlords, these men's Christianity made them safer and more reliable agents of their projects to map and colonize southern Sudan. And Syrian doctors were really at the front lines of these coercive attempts. They were attempts that were militarized, and in particular around a disease called sleeping sickness, especially in southern Sudan. And sleeping sickness would become central to the construction of tropical medicine, itself a field born of racialized fictions. Naim and men like him also played a role in mediating between Western biomedicine and a multiplicity of healing practices. Indeed, healing practices were as abundant as the peoples of Sudan, peoples that British colonial officials and their handlers attempted to contain in the term native. Naim had occupied the position of a superior, albeit second-tier doctor, healing quote-unquote backward natives. When he returned to Palestine to establish his private practice in the early 1920s, he faced the reality that the very British rule he had emulated rendered him a rootless native, unworthy of self-determination. It was these transformations and multiplicities of positions that inspired me to ask, who is an Arab? How does that category native take shape? And what can Sudan reveal about that history? And I'll just stop here to say that before Naeem led me to this story actually hasn't been written. The story of Syrian Christian doctors in Sudan has not been written. And so this is another, hope that we follow the instincts that we have, because they actually often reveal stories that have not yet been written. So this takes me to the last character of our time together, Edward Atiyah, who really offered me one of the most powerful answers to my questions. The Atiyah family chronicle goes back 300 years. And it begins with two brothers that traveled to get a firman, or an approval, in the 19th century to build a Greek Orthodox church in Mount Lebanon in the village of Suq al-Ghar. Another branch of the family settled in the plain of Acre beyond Tripoli. Edward's paternal grandfather converted to Protestantism and became a famous preacher who moved to Beirut. And we talked a bit about this. Some people who aren't here today were asking me, and some people who are, about the distinctions between Eastern Christians and Western Christians. And the Atiyah family actually really traveled those distinctions in interesting ways that we can talk about more. Edward's father, Salim Atiyah, was a medical officer in Durman, which is how I met the Atiyah family. His father and uncle had joined the Anglo-Egyptian government after the very famous Battle of Durman in 1898, where the British took vengeance on the defeat that they had experienced with the Mahdiya, who we've talked about a lot. Originally invested in British colonialism as a, quote, divinely appointed mission, Atiyah eventually would become the secretary of the Arab League, the regional organization of Arab states established in 1945. So today we travel another set of sources: autobiography, opinion editorials, and literary works. Atiyah's autobiography, An Arab Tells His Story, A Study in Loyalties, and his opinion editorials in the British press have really offered me a unique window into the processes of becoming Syrian and Arab. In these writings, and its particular location in Sudan, in these writings, Atiyah frames himself as a translator, a mediator, whose duty was to, quote, interpret to the British government the thoughts and feelings of the educated Sudanese, end of quote. Atiyah infantilized the peoples of Sudan in similar ways to the Syrian medical doctors throughout the story that I'm tracing in my great-grandfather's history. But the peoples of Sudan and British colonialism together challenged men like Atiyah and Syrian Christians' confidence in their own mediation more broadly. Let's step into Atiyah's logic and trace its shifts over time. At the beginning of his autobiography, Atiyah described his upbringing in a Syria that had, quote, no sense of nationality, end of quote. England, France, and Germany appear neatly homogeneous in language and ethnicity, places of historical continuity and plenty. Syria's heterogeneity, in contradistinction, was a liability. In this way, Atiyah both embodied and critiqued modernist logics in its Nahda and Arab nationalist iterations. A key station and vector of these logics were confessional loyalties. Each confession, Atiyah explained, had its leanings. the Muslims to Turkey, the Roman Catholics to the French, the Greek Orthodox to the Russians, and the Protestants, of course, to the English. Living among a Muslim majority and, quote, subject to the domination of an alien Muslim power, end of quote, the Christian sects of Syria, as he put it, as he tried to represent also, were devoid of any sense of tradition or pride of nationality, in his words. And this was derived their importance from, quote, their largely one-sided association with the nations of the West. This association, quote, ministered to their vanity and, quote, mitigated the humiliations of their inferior position. Syrian Christians, he suggests, came to adopt psychologically the nationality of their respective European co-religionists, end of quote, an adoption they would guard jealously, fervently becoming more royalist than the king. And all of these renditions are periodized, of course. Before the Great War, Syria's quote-unquote spiritual heterogeneity was a liability for Atiyah, and Arab civilization, he insisted, was dead. Syrian Christians, he would often say, hated Turkish dominion and, quote, looked to their brothers in Christ for liberation. That liberation would never come. But still, in this rendition, Europeans were a quote-unquote superior race. Christians in this Syrian Christians belonged to what he said were the weaker but more righteous group, parallel to Black Americans. As he narrated a coming of age to enlightenment, Atiyah crafted a subject who was necessarily anti-racist in the same breath that he fortified racialized understandings. So as a paradigmatic case of the righteous persecuted collective, the Black American experience in his writings stands alongside depictions of the quote-unquote primitive African. This rendering of Blackness as both an aspirational comparison and the location of the primitive may appear paradoxical, but it is part and parcel of racial thinking. Sudan for Atiyah and many Syrian Christians was a place of aspiration, a place to enact and redefine superiority and to confront inferiority. It was a place of reckoning, where Atiyah began to understand the contours of colonial hubris. He was not a brother in that enterprise, but an object of it. At the same time, his shaping of the Arab as an anti-colonial way of being, and it would take him a while to get to that anti-colonial way of thought, became interestingly contingent on the mediation of the quote-unquote primitive Sudanese, which is sometimes, but not always, synonymous with Black. So Atiyah, like all of the historical actors we've accompanied this week, teach us that race and specifically Blackness are central to notions of the modern Arab. In this broader history of the modern Arab, and also in particular in the history of Syrian Christians, the year 1860 has long been acknowledged as a crucial turning point when Ottoman multi-ethnic pluralism gave way to sectarian logics exacerbated by imperial misgovernance and European intervention. A thread of self-critique informed Atiyah's renditions of this transformational moment. Syrian Christians, he suggested, would indulge in reminiscences of 1860 when the Druze, quote, led them into a courtyard and slaughtered them like sheep, end of quote. The memory of that massacre, quote, remained for a long time fresh in the minds of Christians, end of quote. Memory then became this threshold space and practice of inheritance. The year 60 became a landmark. People dated events before and after it. Around November 1908, Atiyah's mother informed him that they were moving from Beirut to Durman to join his father. He had no idea what life would be like, but he knew not to feel afraid. as, quote, the English would protect us from the Muslims, end of quote. A new category suddenly comes into play, white, in the child's life. His mother would occasionally, quote, hire Sudanese boys to play with me, there being no white children available, end of quote. Sudan was then a place where certain categories eroded and others crystallized. And it became, interestingly, an exit from what Atiyah called the Protestant colony that he lived in Beirut and its religious animosities. And he knew, he says, I know that these Sudanese are Muslims, but they don't seem to be our enemies. These people, Atiyah explained, seemed kind and friendly. At the same time, the relational hierarchy was clear. Quote, Sudanese people visited us. They were our servants. And sometimes I played with Sudanese boys. Sudan also, however, worked to dislodge attachments to 1860 as the beginning of time. He says, quote, we even had Druze friends who came to our house. And when a still loyal Edward asked his mother, aren't these the same Druze that massacred the Christians in year 60? And she patiently replied, yes, dear, but that was a long time ago. In Sudan, Atiyah then took part in crafting a spectrum of backwardness and civilization. Sudan made legible the primitive who stood at the bottom of the civilizational ladder. These gradations came into view at various instances. And the encounter with technology is one of them. In 1914, Atiyah and his family first encounter an airplane in Durman. As spectators gathered to watch its landing, a young Edward is consumed with excitement, painting a landscape of civilizational difference. Quote, a good many of the natives were still skeptical that a real man should come in a machine flying like a bird. One of the spectators had remarked, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would never have believed it, end of quote. Atiyah characterized this reaction, quote, as an extreme case of unquestioning credulity in a primitive African. And yet, even in Syria and Egypt, unsophisticated minds, he said, with a great civilization in their cultural background, these inventions made a profound impression. And the other interesting thing that's happening is also Sudan makes clear to Atiyah and I believe many others, internal divisions even within Syria, right? So he starts talking about the differences of people living on the coast, their interaction with Europeans versus people, Arabs of the interior, who he called, quote, a primitive race below them in culture. Atiyah eventually would experience two parallel shocks in his system of faith. One, that not everybody believed in God, but even more shocking, that not everybody believed of the quote unquote perfection of the British race. It's no accident that again, that his interaction with the latter happens in Sudan, where this spectrum of civilizational difference becomes apparent to him. The native, the Syrian, the British. A young Edward begins to hear that the British were unpopular, snobbish, and arrogant, that they despised everybody who wasn't British. He heard of instances of English officers striking a native in the souk for not having stood up when he approached, and of another insulting his Syrian or Egyptian subordinate. Thus, this native Egyptian and Syrian sometimes came under the category of Easterners, who were, apart from these incidents, subject to a general attitude of the remote, aloof, and self-glorified British rule. Even the Syrian Christians who had come to Sudan as hero worshippers and self-instituted prodigies of the British, in Atiyah's words, were alienated by these people they had come to understand as their colonizers. It was in Sudan, too, and just before the outbreak of the Great War, that Edward began to nurture sexualized desire, a desire that itself was contingent on race. quote, my last relations with white girls of my age had been of a decidedly hostile character. And in Sudan, I had been growing for 3 years without seeing the skirt of a white girl. End of quote. His understanding of pleasure is contingent on the, quote, presence of a girl in the neighborhood. And here I just want to point out the slippage between girl and white girl. So this is the interwar era, in the time of revolution and possibility. And a young Atiyah begins to make his travel north. And he takes what is the now foreclosed Palestine-Damascus route. Along the way, he would learn about and experience the disappointment of many of Syrians across sectarian divides. And it's in the 1920s that he finally made it to his beloved Britain. As he approached the English Channel, he faced, quote, bitterly cold wind and menacing clouds, a dense mist on the horizon, and through this mist, emerging gradually in a dim outline, a bleak white cliff. England, Mecca. After long years of waiting and yearning and dreaming, the pilgrim had arrived at the shrine of his gods. And what's wonderful about Atiyah is he's narrating himself and making fun of himself the whole time. So Atiyah receives his education at Oxford, and the Oxford Union debates in particular would become a crucial site where he interacted with a broad array of people, Scots, Irishmen, Englishmen, South Asian people, and there they debated freedom, democracy, justice, and of course colonialism. And it was at one such debate that Atiyah argued against another Scotsman, this was for you, Jessica, Robert Levins, and it was Robert's sister, Jean, who would become Atiyah's future wife. And this is really interesting because as they're beginning to plan the possibility of a future together, our hero occupies yet another racial position, the Oriental. And while it would take some time for them to come to fruition, but they would have a very long and successful marriage, and they would have children who were very accomplished. Shortly after graduation, Atiyah returned to work at Gordon College in Khartoum in the 1920s. And this is really when his commitment to British imperialism begins to wane. In short order, Atiyah confronted the disdain and attitude of British superiors who immersed themselves in what he called an aura of sovereignty and military authority. The sting of segregation was also very deep, and he started to narrate how difficult it was to cross from what he said side to side. And what he meant by that was that most Sudanese people lived in Durman, while Syrians, Greeks, Armenians, and Egyptians lived in Khartoum. And they were socially organized, he complained, into communities that were self-contained and distinctly separate. So the weight of this kind of exclusion really begins to be heavy on Edward's Anglophilia. So while these realizations brought Atiyah into a closer proximity to the peoples of Sudan, that relationship continued to be one of superiority and mediation. Atiyah described his students at Gordon College as, quote, coming mostly from backward homes, end of quote. Their ancestors living, quote, traditional lives completely unaffected by foreign ideas, end of quote. So now, it was only now that they were coming under the influence of Western thought, as well as the, quote, example of other and more advanced Eastern countries, end of quote. Atiyah described Sudanese people as suffering from contempt and pity for themselves, for being so backward and poor and ignorant, and for their collective feelings of inferiority. And so he describes self-assertion as really born of Western education. And here I want to I've spent some time over the last 3 days really talking about the history of the distinction between the Arab and the Black in Sudan, and really talked about its pre-colonial history. And I just want to articulate for you here what it means in this later 20th century moment. For Atiyah, the educated generation, quote, emphasized their Arab descent and excluded from their consciousness their association with Africa. So here you see how a much longer, broader historical process, what it means in this 20th century moment. But in this whole mess of civilizational and racial hierarchies, Atiyah still found relief from the aloofness of his British masters by becoming nearer to the Sudanese while being conscious of a moral superiority to them. Okay, so it's through Atiyah that I came to understand that it is actually in Sudan that many of these Syrian Christians begin to understand themselves as colonized and white. So we're more like these Sudanese people, but we're a little bit better than them. Okay. So, and this is clear because, you know, he celebrates some of his Sudanese pupils like Muawiyah Nur, who would become a medical doctor. And he says, this is the first Sudanese boy to make real contact with the spirit of the West. And, you know, whenever you see anybody claiming the first of anything, you know, it's a bad deal. Like, just don't claim it. You never know. You never know. And he celebrates, you know, Muawiyah had never crossed the frontiers of Sudan, and he came from a household where women could not read or write, even Arabic, he says. But this promising pupil, he made sure to say, was from an old and noted Arab family. So you begin to see how Atiyah begins to perceive what then he starts calling racial slights everywhere, where he becomes humiliated, disgusted, and enraged. And there was a very formative turning point that took place when the Governor General of Sudan visited Gordon College, and the non-British staff were confined to their common room out of sight. And it's really this banishment that is Atiyah's last straw. He comes to understand himself as on the side of the subject races, he says. He was liberated, not by an intellectual process, but in his words, an emotional reaction and wounded feelings that had awakened him to the shackles of a political outlook which had been implanted in me by all the influences of my early life. Rapidly, Atiyah began to invest in notions of freedom, equality, and independence, which in his words, he had previously looked upon with mistrust as the claptrap of demagogues. And in 1924, lo and behold, Atiyah declares himself an Arab nationalist. The shaping of this Arab nationalism, of course, has a long and layered history that entailed a spectrum of ideologies and affiliations that scholars now include in the Nahda, from the confessional to the Islamist, from the radical to the moderate, from the socialist to the capitalist. But what I'm trying to add here is that Edward and Naim really teach us about the ways that Sudan has been a crucial and neglected site of the formation of this Arab nationalism. In Sudan, Syrian Christians, as I said earlier, began to understand themselves as at once white and colonized. And they shifted from confessionalism and Anglophilia as sources of identity to this broader identity of a new iteration of the Arab. Sudan has also more to teach us about another place of becoming Arab, Palestine. Let me return to Atiyah once again here in his trajectory after 1924. He'd come into being as an Arab nationalist, but he remained invested in the promise of an Anglo-Arab world. For Atiyah, Christian Arabs had a particular role. They stood halfway between the Arab world and Europe. Their language, and to a certain extent, he said their race, made their bonds with Europe really strong and derived of moral values and social institutions that were derived from religion. But this faith too would break in the interwar era. And of course, what would really rupture it more than anything else were the Anglo-French machinations that we spent a great deal of time talking about yesterday, the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration, which really shocked any kind of loyalty to British civilization and inspired a lasting disillusion. And the British and French mandatory governments that partitioned Syria into smaller states imposed, in Atiyah's words, the old imperialism in a new and hypocritical form that completely ignored the will of the people it ruled. The plight of Palestine in particular, he said, for the plight of Palestine in particular, there seemed to be no duress. Atiyah explained, while a reasonable settlement had been reached in Iraq and formulated for Syria, it was becoming bitterly clear that the Palestine Arabs were precluded from all hope of achieving a similar satisfaction for their national aspirations. By 1936, the Great Revolt in Palestine was in full swing. This uprising, which was against both British colonialism and Zionist settlement, as well as elite Palestinian politics, but we can talk more about that in discussion, had begun as a 6-month boycott and continued for 3 years of armed struggle. It would be the most difficult interwar struggle for the British to fight in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the British counterinsurgency that contained the revolt introduced repressive strategies that Palestinians continue to live with today: targeted assassinations, home demolitions, detention without trial, and collective punishment. These realities made it clear to Atiyah that the Arabs of Palestine were, in his words, in danger of ultimately becoming a minority in their own country, and a landless minority at that. In the 1940s, upon his return to London, where he would live the rest of his life, Atiyah obdurately made the case for Palestine. He faced British intransigence at every turn. Quote, I just could not understand why the champions of freedom in the British Parliament and the British press should resent the doing of such elementary justice to a small Arab nation that merely desired to be free in its land. Then suddenly I saw the explanation. For these advocates of freedom, the Arabs did not count. This is a really important moment in the break of the faith in British liberalism and British imperial civilization, understanding the Arabs just don't count. As secretary of the Arab League, this realization of who counted and who didn't would inform his advocacy until his death. And here I have to add all my thanks to my hosts at CEU, because I am now beginning to accompany Edward in an entirely new way, thanks to you. On stumbling across an announcement of this talk today, Ghassan Atiyah, a relative of Edward, contacted me. I learned from him that there is so much more to learn about Edward and his journey. For you see, Atiyah would continue his writing and thinking, and continue working through the problem and the promise of what it meant to be Arab. And with the inception of the Nakba in 1948 and the betrayals of British Empire, when they took a catastrophic turn, Atiyah turned to fiction, and in particular, the genre of the crime novel. In this book, called The Thin Line, published in 1951, Atiyah told the story of Peter, who murders his mistress and attempts to conceal the crime while maintaining his suburban domesticity. And here, this is where, in Atiyah's autobiography, for the question about religiosity, in Atiyah's autobiography, he's really overtaken by his guilt about original sin, and all of his being overtaken by guilt really gets articulated in his literature in a really interesting way. So on the surface, the novel just reads like a retreat from the political, but if you take a closer look, the thin line of the title isn't just about the boundary between sanity and madness or law and crime. It is really about this porous border between the self that Atiyah had taken so much time to construct the English gentleman, the rational Arab versus the repressed other, the violent native, the murderer. In another book called Lebanon Paradise, which was published in 1953, Atiyah narrated Beirut in 1949, and he shaped a love affair between an upper middle class Lebanese woman named Violet and a talented Palestinian refugee, Musa Kanaan, confined to the then new reality of refugee camps. And this is a fascinating novel because it really it's really trying to do an ethnography of this early 1949 moment. And again, it's full of the class critique that he gets to in his autobiography. But it's wonderful. I'm just entering Atiyah's rich literary world and as ever aware of how much more there is to learn about all of the actors I've accompanied with you this week. Atiyah would remain committed to the Palestinian cause, traveling in circles with luminaries and intellectuals like Albert Hourani and politicians like Musa al-Alami. On Thursday, October 22, 1964, Atiyah prepared to present the case for Palestine yet again at one of his favorite venues, the Oxford Union. And shortly after he rose to speak on behalf of another boycott strategy, in continuation of the one we heard about yesterday, Edward Atiyah collapsed with an attack of coronary thrombosis. He died before he could be transported to hospital. He had lived a life of hope and despair. He had witnessed catastrophe and found joy even amidst grief. We are today in an age of catastrophe. We live in a time of interminable grief. In Sudan, the fight for the country between the Sudanese armed forces and the United Arab Emirates-sponsored Rapid Support Forces has killed over 150,000 people, displaced millions, and left more than 30 million people in dire straits as famine rages. The conditions are so severe that images of blood saturating the ground have been picked up by satellite. Not so far away, and separated only by Egypt in Palestine, the Israeli genocide continues. It has killed a drastically undercounted number of 72,000 Palestinians and counting in the Gaza Strip. We watch as Palestinians stand in the rubble of their educational, medical, and social infrastructures amidst the realities of the production of the largest amputee cohort in modern history. We witness as the United States and Israel present forcible expulsion and the starvation of over 2 million Palestinians from Gaza as a real estate deal. We watch too in the West Bank the escalation of settler vigilantism and state annexation. In this age of catastrophe, it is as urgent as ever to accompany ordinary people telling us their extraordinary stories. The lives of Kantusha, Shukair, and Atiyah teach us that Sudan and Palestine are mutually constituting zones of visibility and invisibility. I have proposed historical accompaniment as a method to walk with these people that I've studied through the spaces they've inhabited, not to own their stories, but to acknowledge epistemic complicity and the limits of colonial maps. This epistemic complicity surrounds and presses on us everywhere today, and its political, methodological, and personal inventories have forced me time and again, and always with love, into a sustained reflection on the meaning of archives, the writing of history, and the inextricability of history from the lived present. Thank you.